From gruesome deaths to endless hard labor, the punishments for even the smallest offenses were severe. Have you ever wondered what kind of crimes would warrant such harsh penalties? Let's step back in time and discover the brutal world of ancient Egypt's justice system. In ancient Egypt, stealing public property was considered a heinous crime, especially if the stolen object had significant religious or cultural value. The Egyptians believed that stealing from the public property was equivalent to stealing from the gods, and thus was a serious offense that warranted severe punishment. If someone was found guilty of stealing from public property, the penalty was often up to 180 times the value of the stolen materials. The accused would be ordered to return the stolen goods, and after confessing to the crime would often receive a public beating of 100 strokes by hand as punishment. In some cases, if the stolen item was particularly valuable, the accused would be thrown into the river to be devoured by crocodiles. The entire sentence would be carried out in front of everyone as a warning to others who might consider committing a similar crime. In some cases, the punishment was reduced to the cutting off of hands or the beating of 100 blows if the mummy was left untouched. Special laws were created to safeguard the tombs of the pharaohs, and anyone caught violating them would face harsh consequences. The penalty for the stealing from a temple, whether it was an artifact or an animal, was also severe, with a punishment of 100 blows and 100 times the usual fine. Even those who slowed in solving the problems, such as judges who failed to deliver swift justice, were not spared punishment. In one case, the judge of the city of Mayat Ra received 100 strikes, was removed from his position, and was placed as a cultivation agent. In prehistoric Egypt, committing adultery was viewed as a serious sin, and a death penalty was imposed to prevent the spread of this immoral act. Ptahhotep preached that 1,000 men die every year because they are infatuated with women. Committing adultery with a married woman was considered a felony deserving of death, as it could lead to other sins. If a married woman committed a crime, her husband had the option of punishing her, forgiving her, or referring the case to court. The Egyptians believed that adultery was primarily the fault of the woman, and so women were put to death while men received a much lesser sentence of 1,000 lashes. In the case of theft of private property, the offender faced a fine of up to 3 times the value of the stolen items, while theft of public property resulted in a fine of up to 180 times the value of the items taken. After a thorough confession, the accused might be released from the penalty of being beaten 100 times by hand, taking an oath, or being thrown into the river to be devoured by crocodiles in full public view. Many people assume that slaves built the pyramids, and historians argue that skilled craftsmen actually did most of the work. However, criminals still played a major role in this monumental task. They were considered a permanent crew and had the excruciating job of cutting millions of stone blocks out of the rock cliffs, which would be used to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. In fact, a whopping 2.3 million blocks of stone were quarried just to build that one pyramid. This shows just how severe the consequences of being a criminal were in ancient Egypt. While the paid craftsmen who constructed the pyramids only worked on the project for 2 months out of the year, prisoners had no days off. But it wasn't just the pyramids that the criminals had to work on. Forced labor was prevalent in ancient Egypt, as it was more useful to use culprits than to imprison them. Rather than being locked up, they were put to work in the gold mines of the Eastern Desert, or threatened with exile to Nubia, which is modern-day northern Sudan. Many criminals were even enslaved and used as farming laborers and domestic servants. However, the most grueling job was undoubtedly the mining of granite in the quarries. This job required intense muscle power and strenuous effort, which could result in serious injuries or even death. So the next time you're feeling a little lazy, just be thankful that you're not a criminal in ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians regarded grave robbing as a grave offense, particularly if the tomb belonged to a royal figure such as a king, queen, or prince. Such a crime was considered an attack on the state, and the punishment was death. However, if the mummy was left untouched, the penalty could be reduced to the cutting off of hands or a beating of 100 blows. Special laws were enacted to safeguard these tombs from any kind of aggression. Stealing from a temple, whether it be an artifact or an animal, carried a penalty of 100 blows and a fine of 100 times the usual amount. In addition, anyone who was sluggish enough in resolving such a crime, like the judge of the city of Mayat Ra, was subject to 100 strikes, stripped of their position, and reassigned as a cultivation agent. In the time of Ramses IX, several criminals, including grave robbers who had broken into the tomb of a king, were released by paying bribes. Treason was considered the most heinous crime in all of human history, and the only punishment, regardless of the accused's social standing, was death. particularly if the defendants were close to the monarch. Such was the case when King Ramses III chose an heir to his throne who incited jealousy among his middle-class wife, Ti. She plotted to assassinate the king and place her son, Natawar, on the throne. The conspirators, including Ti, were caught, prosecuted, and punished. Moreover, those who committed crimes against the king were denied a proper burial, and their bodies were thrown into the river. To prevent violence and ensure that the death penalty was used justly, the ancient Egyptians created a strong deterrent. Capital punishment was reserved for premeditated murder, and in some cases psychological punishments were deemed harsher than execution. For instance, if a father murdered his child, his body would be tied to the victims for 3 days until decomposition, and he would be guarded the entire time. Those who weaved harm were given a warning. Those who were sentenced to death by the public were said to have been given the option to take their own lives. Unintentional manslaughter had no set punishment, but the offender had to atone for their mistake, make sacrifices, ask for forgiveness from the victim's family, and compensate them fairly before being allowed to return home. If anyone concealed or withheld information about a murder, they would be brought before the court, and if found guilty, serve their sentence in the same location. Those who knowingly killed a religiously significant animal might face the death penalty. Numerous studies have focused on the concept of Ma'at, which was highly valued by the ancient Egyptians. The principles of balance, order, justice, truth, and harmony formed the core of the philosophical concept of Ma'at, which was considered the foundation of human society and the cosmos. Ma'at encouraged peaceful coexistence and emphasized the importance of aligning oneself with its principles in order to overcome the failures and dishonesty of one's earthly life. The teachings of Minister Ptahhotep of the 5th dynasty, 2500 BC, which have been translated, state that it is a path that stretches out before the ignorant, but the poor will never allow a birth in any port. But the power of Ma'at, truth and justice, is that it transcends the days, and one can say about it, it is indeed the wealth that my father possessed. The ancient Egyptians' deep philosophical thought, emphasis on justice and order, and strict governance of all aspects of life allowed them to maintain a clear sense of their country, which contributed to the miraculous persistence of their civilization for thousands of years. This is evident in their writing and the structure of their society, which maintained a balanced approach to all aspects of life, ensuring the well-being of the Egyptian public. The ancient Egyptians held a deep respect for the sanctity of life, which is why they utilized the death penalty only in cases where it would not violate this principle. The penalty was divided between murder and manslaughter, with intentional murder carrying the death penalty. In cases of patricide or matricide, philosophical sanctions were employed, which were considered more severe than execution. For instance, if a father killed a son or daughter, the body of the killer would be tied to the corpse of the victim for 3 days until decomposition while being guarded. And for a son or daughter who killed a parent, the penalty was burning alive. There were warnings against anyone who threatened to kill another person. Suicide was allowed as a gift to those sentenced to death by the people. In cases of involuntary manslaughter, there were no specific penalties, but the offender was required to perform cleansing rituals, make offerings, seek forgiveness from the family of the victim, and provide appropriate compensation. Those who covered up a murder or withheld information were also punished, and if found guilty, they would face the same penalty as the offender. Additionally, anyone who intentionally killed an animal with religious significance would be subject to the death penalty. So, the next time you complain about a minor punishment, just remember the ancient Egyptians and their brutal methods. From amputations to crocodile attacks, their justice system was not for the faint of heart, but it certainly kept people in line.